The rain came down in sheets the night Mara Sutton stopped running. She had been moving for 20 minutes through the dark edge of Cassell, Montana, her bare feet slapping against wet asphalt, her breath coming in ragged pulls that tasted like blood. The October cold had gone past, biting into something deeper, something that settled into bone and stayed there. She didn't feel it anymore. She didn't feel much of anything except the burning along her left cheekbone where Preston Voss's ring had caught her, and the dull throb behind her right eye that told her the swelling hadn't finished yet. The gas station appeared out of the rain like something from a dream. A single canopy of yellow light over two pumps, a convenience store, with a flickering open sign, and at the far edge of the lot parked so still it might have been part of the landscape a motorcycle. A Harley-Davidson black and chrome rumbling at idle like distant thunder. Mara collapsed against the nearest pump. Her legs simply stopped working. She grabbed the metal housing and held on while the world tilted around her, while the rain plastered her hair flat against her face and mixed with the blood from her split lip and ran down her chin in thin pink rivers. She heard boots on wet pavement. She didn't look up. She was past looking up at strangers in the dark. "Who did this to you?" It wasn't a question. The voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned long ago that volume changed nothing about the truth of a situation. Mara finally raised her head. The man standing 10 feet away was large in the way that mountains are large, not threatening exactly, but immovable. He wore a leather vest over a dark shirt, both arms covered in tattoos that the rain had turned slick and dark. His beard was thick-shot through with gray. He might have been 40, might have been older, but his eyes, pale and steady in the gas station light, held something Mara hadn't seen directed at her in longer than she could remember. Not pity, not hunger, recognition. She didn't answer his question. She just looked at him, and he looked back at her bruised face, and something shifted in the rain between them. His name was Cole Hunter, and he had been watching the same video as the rest of Cassell for the past 4 hours. 3 days earlier, Mara Sutton had made the mistake of being brave. Cassell, Montana sat in a valley between two mountain ranges that had been slowly giving up their coal for 60 years. The town had grown up around the mine's churches and diners and hardware stores, and a high school whose trophy cases stopped filling up sometime around 2004 when the second mine contracted and the third one closed and the families who could leave began to leave. The ones who stayed learned the particular art of endurance that dying towns teach you, kept your head down. You tended your own. You did not make trouble with people who had more than you. The Voss family had always had more than most. Sheriff Dale Voss had held his office for 24 years. He was a broad man gone thick in the middle with pale blue eyes that had never fully warmed to anything Mara could remember seeing, and a way of occupying space in a room that made everyone in it aware of exactly who held authority. His cruiser was always clean, his uniform was always pressed, and in Cassell, his word had always been the final word on everything that mattered. His son Preston was 18, a senior at Cassell High, and had understood since approximately the age of 12 that the ordinary rules did not apply to him. He was good-looking in the way that certain kinds of cruelty can look like confidence from a distance, broad-shouldered, easy in his movements, with a smile that arrived and departed without ever quite reaching his eyes. He ran with 3 others, Harlan Briggs, whose father owned the remaining active mine, Riker Sloan, who drove a truck his parents had bought with money nobody asked too many questions about, and Grady Fenn, who was quieter than the others and watched everything with a stillness that if Mara had understood it sooner would have frightened her more than any of the rest. Mara Sutton was 17, a junior, and had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility. She knew which hallways Preston and his group used and when. She knew which bathrooms were safe between classes. She knew that the table in the far left corner of the cafeteria, partly hidden by the emergency exit door, was the table where you could eat without someone deciding your presence was an inconvenience. She had learned all of this the way you learn anything important in a place like Cassell, not from being taught, but from being heard enough times that the lesson finally stuck. Her mother Delia had built the same knowledge into the walls of the diner. Delia's diner occupied a converted A-frame on Highway 12 3 blocks from what passed for downtown Cassell. Delia Sutton had opened it 11 years ago with her husband Roy, when Roy was still alive, and the mines were still hiring, and the future looked like something you could actually plan for. After Roy died, Delia had kept it running through sheer refusal to let one more thing be taken from her. The tables were mismatched. The coffee was strong. The pie was made from scratch every morning at 5:30. The regulars left decent tips and called Delia by her first name and treated the place like an extension of their own kitchens, which is the only way a diner in a dying town stays alive. On that Friday afternoon in late October, Mara was running the register while her mother handled the dinner rush and back. The place was three-quarters full. Outside, the first real cold front of the season was pressing down from the north, and the windows had gone gray with the promise of the rain that would arrive before midnight. Preston Voss walked in with Harlan and Riker. Mara saw them before they saw her. She had that reflex well developed, the one that scanned a room for threat, the way other people scan for empty tables. She kept her expression neutral and her eyes down and reached for the order pad, because the move that had always served her best was to make herself part of the furniture before anyone remembered she existed. It didn't work that afternoon. Preston slid into a booth near the window without looking at a menu, because men who have never paid for anything don't need to check prices. He said something to Harlan that made Harlan laugh. Riker pulled out his phone. Then Preston looked toward the register and found Mara looking back at him, and his expression did the thing it always did, settled into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried all the weight of one. "Hey, trash girl!" His voice cut across the half-full diner without effort. Several conversations stopped. "You forget to wash your hands after taking out the garbage, or is that just how you always smell?" The silence that followed had texture. Mara felt it against her skin like something physical. 10 people at their tables. Forks suspended. A coffee cup set down carefully quietly so as not to draw attention. She kept her eyes on the order pad. Her pen moved to the top line and stopped there. "I'm talking to you," Preston said. Louder. The kitchen door swung open and Delia appeared, wiping her hands on her apron, reading the room the way she'd learned to read it. Her eyes moved from the booth to Mara and back. Her hands went still. Mara walked toward the booth with the order pad because it was the only move available to her that didn't require looking at Preston directly, didn't require acknowledging that any of this was happening. She was going to take his order. She was going to go back to the kitchen. She was going to make herself invisible again, the way she always did, the way that had kept them both safe for 3 years in a town where safety was the only currency that mattered. Then Preston said, "My father told me your mother's probably turning tricks for the truckers who come through here. That how you afford this dump? She's spreading herself around for anyone willing to pay." Harlan laughed. Riker raised his phone, and something in Mara Sutton broke open. She stopped walking. She stood in the center of the diner with the order pad in her hand and the pen that had stopped moving, and 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility dissolving around her like smoke. "Get out," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, almost no volume at all, but the room heard it. The room had been holding its breath for exactly this word. Preston tilted his head. "What did you just say to me?" "I said, get out of my mother's restaurant." Her voice found more volume now. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she could hear the pen rattling against the pad. She didn't try to stop the shaking. She just kept talking. "You don't get to come in here and talk about her like that. You don't get to talk about her at all." The silence in the diner had become absolute. Riker's phone was definitely recording now. Delia started toward her daughter from the kitchen doorway. "Mara." "No." Mara didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Preston, who had stopped smiling, whose face had gone through something she hadn't seen there before. A kind of flat, calculating attention, like an animal deciding how seriously to take a threat. "I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of people like him treating us like we're nothing. You come into our place and you disrespect my mother in front of everyone, and you think nothing happens because nothing ever happens. Because this town lets you do whatever you want." She took one step toward the booth. "Get out before I call the police. Not your father, the actual police." For 3 seconds, nobody in the diner moved. Then Preston's face did something complicated, and he stood up from the booth and grabbed his jacket from the seat and pushed past Mara hard enough that she stumbled against the nearest table. Harlan and Riker followed, laughing, Riker's phone still raised and recording. At the door, Preston stopped. He turned back. His voice was very quiet now, quieter than it had been all evening, and that quietness was worse than the volume had been. "You're dead," he said. "You understand me. You're done." The door closed behind them. Mara stood in the center of the diner, gripping the edge of a table with both hands shaking so badly she thought her legs might go. Around her, the customers sat in the stillness of people who have witnessed something they already know they won't talk about. Delia reached her in 4 steps. Her hands went to Mara's shoulders. "What did you do?" she whispered. "Mara, what did you just do?" "I don't know," Mara said. And then, because it was true, "I think I just got really tired." The video went up that night. By 10 o'clock, it had 4,000 views on the local community page. By midnight, it had 14,000. The comments sorted themselves into 2 camps, with nothing in between: the people who said she was brave and the people who said she was stupid and finished. And the second camp was larger and louder and knew exactly what the Voss name meant in Cassell, Montana. Mara lay in her narrow bed in their trailer on the east edge of town and read the comments until her eyes burned, and then she turned off her phone and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind work at the walls. The trailer had been home since before her father died. Roy Sutton had bought it used and spent 3 weekends reinforcing the insulation and hanging drywall over the original paneling and telling Delia it was temporary just until the diner got established, just until they had a little more put aside. That was 7 years ago. The drywall had yellowed. The insulation did its best. 3 miles away, in the parking lot of a bar called the Iron Compass, on the edge of Route 89, Cole Hunter sat on his Harley in the dark and watched the same video on his phone twice through. He watched the girl with the shaking hands stand her ground in the middle of a diner. He watched the boy who had never paid a consequence for anything push her hard enough to make her stumble. He watched the door close. His jaw was tight, his thumb scrolled through the comments. He'd pulled into Cassell 2 weeks ago for reasons that had nothing to do with Mara Sutton. The chapter had business in the county land, matters the usual friction between people who own things and people who needed to move through places where things were owned. He'd planned to be gone in 5 days. He was still here, and he wasn't entirely certain why, except that something about Cassell felt like a place where things were about to come loose from their moorings. And Cole Hunter had learned over 41 years to pay attention to that feeling. He put his phone away. He sat in the dark and let the engine idle under him. He didn't sleep much that night. The vandalism started Monday. Mara arrived at the diner after school to find both front windows smashed inward, glass scattered across the floor between the door and the counter, and the word "rats" sprayed in red across the door in letters 2 feet high. Her mother was standing in the parking lot with her phone pressed to her ear, her face doing the thing it did when she was working very hard not to come apart. "Yes, I'd like to report vandalism at Delia's Diner on Highway 12. A pause. "I've been on hold for 20 minutes. Another pause, longer. "No, I can't. I need someone to come here." A shorter pause this time. Then Delia lowered the phone and looked at the screen and looked at her daughter. "They hung up," she said. Mara looked at the smashed windows and the glass and the red letters on the door and understood something she hadn't fully understood before, something that existed below the level of words and operated purely as cold certainty in the center of her chest. They weren't going to come. They were never going to come. Whatever protection the law was supposed to represent in Cassell, Montana, it did not extend to a woman named Delia Sutton and her daughter, who had embarrassed the wrong family on a Friday afternoon. What Mara did not know yet, what she would only understand weeks later when the full shape of things had revealed itself, was that the deputy who answered Delia's call had gone directly to Sheriff Dale Voss after hanging up. That Voss had known about each of the 3 calls within minutes of their placement. That the organized nature of what followed, the timing, the escalation, the deliberate progression from vandalism to threat to fire, had never been Preston acting impulsively. It had been his father methodically applying pressure with the confidence of a man who had been doing exactly this to exactly these kinds of people for 24 years without ever once facing a consequence. Delia went inside and got a broom. Mara got the dustpan. Tuesday brought dead rats arranged behind the dumpster, 4 of them in a rough circle positioned with a deliberateness that took effort and intended to communicate something specific. Wednesday produced threatening notes slipped through the mail slot, printed on plain white paper unsigned. One said, "Watch yourself." One said, "Know your place." One said something worse that Mara folded in half and threw away before her mother could read it. On Thursday, Mara was walking home from school along the shoulder of Route 89 when a black truck slowed alongside her. The passenger window came down. Riker Sloan grinned from the seat. Harlan Briggs drove. "Heard your mom's restaurant is closing soon," Riker said. "Shame. Where's she going to work next?" He threw a beer bottle. It exploded on the asphalt 6 inches from Mara's left foot. She stood on the shoulder while they pulled away laughing glass fragments still settling around her sneakers and felt something happening inside her that she didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't fear anymore, or it wasn't only fear. It was fear with something harder underneath it. Something that had been accumulating since Friday night and hadn't found its shape until this moment on a highway shoulder with broken glass at her feet and exhaust fumes fading in the October air. She walked the rest of the way home. By Friday, Delia's diner had lost half its regular customers. The lunch rush that usually filled 9 tables now filled 4. The phone sat quiet during hours when it used to ring steadily with takeout orders. The family who came in every Friday for the fish special, the Harrisons 6 years running, didn't come. The 2 retired miners who took the corner booth every morning for coffee and the local paper gone. Not with explanation, not with apology, just absent, in the way that people become absent when they've made a calculation about which side of a line is safer to stand on. Delia counted the register at closing on Friday night, and the numbers were bad enough that she stood at the counter for a long moment with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed. And Mara, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt something in her own chest respond to the sight of her mother's stillness, like a chord struck on an instrument she'd been carrying without knowing it. "Mom, we're going to lose it." Delia's voice was even. "If this keeps up another 2 weeks, we're going to lose the restaurant." "I know. I should have." "Don't." Mara crossed the floor and stood beside her mother and put her hand over one of Delia's. "Don't say you should have let it go. Don't say you should have made me stay quiet. Because that's what they want us to think, that we brought this on ourselves." Delia turned to look at her daughter. Her eyes were dry, but her expression held something complicated, something between grief and a fierce and exhausted love. "When did you get old enough to say things like that?" "I don't know," Mara said. "Maybe last Friday." That night at 2 in the morning, someone threw a brick through the window of Mara's bedroom. She came out of sleep into a world of noise and cold and glass, and it took her 3 full seconds to understand what had happened. The window gone, the October air pouring in fragments across her bed and her pillow, and the small rug beside it. The brick lay against the far baseboard with a piece of paper rubber banded around it. Last warning. Delia called 911. She stayed on the line for 8 minutes. A deputy would be dispatched when someone was available, she was told. Come by in the morning to file a report if it seemed necessary. No one came. Mara sat on the edge of her bed with the blanket around her shoulders and a piece of glass she'd picked up without thinking, still in her hand, turning it over and over, and looked at the hole where her window had been and at the cold black square of Montana night beyond it, and understood completely, and without the possibility of comfort, that they were alone in this. Then she heard motorcycles, 5 of them from the sound pulling into the gravel area outside the trailer. The rumble settled into idle and went quiet. Mara looked through the broken window and saw the bikes parked in a rough semicircle, leather-clad figures standing beside them, one of them pointing at the trailer and speaking to the others. Delia appeared in Mara's doorway with a kitchen knife. "Bathroom," Delia said. "Lock the door." "Mom, now." 3 calm knocks at the front door. Not urgent, not threatening, measured. Delia moved through the trailer with the knife held low against her thigh and put her eye to the peephole and then stood there for a moment with her hand on the deadbolt. "What do you want?" she said through the door. "My name is Cole Hunter." The voice was the same one Mara had heard once before at a gas station in the rain, the same unhurried register. "I'm here because I saw what happened to your daughter online, and because I can see from here that someone put a brick through a window tonight, and I'm guessing the sheriff's office told you they'd get around to it when they could." Silence from Delia's side of the door. "I knew a woman once," Cole continued, "who fed me when I was broke and passing through. Didn't ask what I rode or what I wore or where I'd been. Just put a plate in front of me and treated me like a person deserved to be treated. That was about 5 years ago. Place called Delia's Diner on Highway 12. Mara watched her mother's hand tighten on the knife, watched the other hand come up and rest flat against the door. "I never forgot it," Cole said. "So I'm asking you once, Mrs. Sutton, do you want help or do you want me to get back on my bike and leave you to whatever comes next alone?" Delia stood at the door for 10 full seconds. Then she looked back at her daughter. Mara nodded. Delia unlocked the door. Cole Hunter in person was the same presence he'd been at the gas station, large and still filling the door frame without imposing past it, his pale eyes moving from Delia's face to the kitchen knife, to the hallway beyond, and back with a thoroughness that was professional rather than threatening. He looked at Mara's face. He took in the bruising, the swollen eye, the split lip. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "No." "Good." He turned back to Delia. "I've got 5 brothers outside. We're going to stay through the night, make sure nobody decides a brick wasn't enough. In the morning, we'll fix the window. After that, I'd like to have a conversation with you both about what we do next." "And what do we do next?" Delia asked. Cole's expression didn't change, but something in it settled into a kind of quiet certainty that Mara would come to recognize over the following weeks as the thing Cole Hunter did instead of making promises. "Next," he said, "we make sure this town understands that hurting your daughter has consequences, that she's not alone anymore, that anyone who comes for her has to come through people who don't frighten easily. The sheriff won't like that. I expect not. He could make things very difficult for you. He can try." Delia looked at this man in her doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. Later, lying on her bed with a piece of cardboard duct taped over the broken window and the sound of idling motorcycles replaced by silence outside, Mara heard her mother crying in the next room. The crying came through the wall quietly, the way grief sounds when someone has been holding it back long enough that the release brings no relief, only the weight of everything that was held. Mara stared at the cardboard square and thought about Roy Sutton. Her father had been gone 3 years. He died in the explosion at the Black Ridge mine on a Tuesday morning in November, along with 2 other men who had last names nobody in the county courthouse had ever found particularly important. The official investigation had taken 4 months and produced a finding of mechanical failure equipment that hadn't been properly maintained, a valve that had been flagged for replacement 6 months earlier and never replaced. The mine's ownership, a company called Harwell Energy, had paid out modest settlements to the affected families. The settlements came with documents that used the word closure a great deal. Delia had never believed it. She'd said so once to Mara quietly in the kitchen of the diner on the first anniversary of Roy's death. She'd said the timing was wrong and the investigation felt wrong, and certain things that Roy had told her in the weeks before the explosion about management pressure, about corners being cut, about a conversation he'd had with someone he wouldn't name, didn't fit the story the report told. She had said it once. She had never said it again. Because in Cassell, Montana, certain things were understood without being spoken. Mara hadn't thought about it in months. She thought about it now, staring at cardboard over a broken window in the dark, with her mother's quiet grief coming through the thin wall between their rooms. She thought same people, same silence. She didn't know yet what the thought meant. She only knew it felt like the start of something. In the morning, Cole and 4 of his brothers arrived at the diner with tools and glass panels and coffee in a cardboard carrier. They replaced Mara's window in 40 minutes. By noon, they had the diner's front windows repaired and the door repainted. Delia tried to pay them. Cole declined with a patience that made clear this was not a negotiation. Why? Delia asked him while her daughter carried scraps to the dumpster around the side. Why does this matter to you? Cole was quiet for a moment the way he went quiet when he was choosing words rather than reaching for them. Because that girl, he said, stood up in front of a room full of people who were waiting to see if she'd back down. And she didn't back down. And in my experience, people who don't back down when they probably should, those people deserve to have someone standing next to them. He looked toward the corner of the building where Mara had disappeared. And because I was in a situation like hers once, different town, different bully, no one standing next to me. Delia didn't say anything. She looked at him for a long moment and then looked at her rebuilt windows and her repainted door. They're going to come back, she said. Yes. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Almost certainly. Then I hope you mean what you're saying about standing next to people. I never say things I don't mean, Cole told her. It's the one discipline I've managed to maintain. By Sunday morning, word had spread through Cassell the way that certain kinds of news spread through small towns, not through announcement, but through the collective recalibration of everyone's understanding of what the situation now was. The bikers were protecting the Sutton women, and everyone in Cassell understood what that meant because Sheriff Dale Voss understood what it meant. And he had made his understanding clear to enough people that the information had distributed itself accordingly. It meant war. Monday morning, Mara arrived at school to find Preston Voss waiting alone at her locker. The careful staging of it, his friends absent the hallway, mostly empty, the particular angle of his body against the lockers, told her this had been planned. He had something to say that he didn't want witnesses for. You think those bikers make you safe? His voice was quiet, controlled. They don't. They'll get bored and move on. They always do. And when they're gone, I'm still going to be here. And my father's still going to be the sheriff. And you're going to be the girl who thought she could embarrass my family and walk away from it. Mara opened her locker. Her hands were steady. She wasn't sure when that had happened, the steadiness, but it was there now, like something that had come through the glass and the threats and the cold and the counting of the register and installed itself without asking. I heard you, she said. Preston grabbed her arm. His grip was hard enough to mark. Then hear me clearly. You are let go of her. Both of them turned. Cole Hunter stood at the end of the corridor. He wasn't supposed to be there. The school had security procedures. Visitors were supposed to check in at the front office. He had apparently not done that. He stood at the end of the hallway in his leather and tattoos and regarded Preston Voss with an expression of complete and unhurried calm, and the hallway, which had begun to accumulate students on their way to first period, went very quiet. Preston released Mara's arm. Cole walked toward them, not fast, deliberate. I'll say this once, he said when he reached them. If you put your hands on her again, I'll see to it that everyone in this county knows exactly what your father has been doing with his authority for 24 years. If you threaten her again, that process begins anyway. And if you hurt her... He stopped 2 feet from Preston and looked at him with those pale, steady eyes. I will make certain that the consequences are ones you will not be able to talk yourself out of. Preston held his gaze for 4 seconds, which was longer than most people managed. Then he turned and walked away down the hallway, and his footsteps were slightly faster than they'd been when he arrived. Cole looked at Mara. You can't keep doing this, she said quietly. You can't just appear everywhere. I didn't appear everywhere. I appeared here because someone told me this was where you'd be this morning. Someone... You have more people paying attention than you know. He looked at her arm where Preston's grip had left a red mark visible below her sleeve. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. Are you all right? I'm fine. She pulled the sleeve down. Why are you doing this, really? Because the story about my mom feeding you doesn't cover all of this. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Because I grew up in a town with a man like Dale Voss running it, he finally said. And when someone stood up to him, when my father stood up to him, no one came. No one stepped in. And my father paid for it in ways that I'm not going to ask you to sit here and listen to in a school hallway. He looked at her steadily. I'm here because no one was there then. That's the whole of it. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Mara stood by her locker and felt something she hadn't felt since the Friday night when this all began. Not safety exactly, but the possibility of it. The awareness that she was not in fact entirely alone. Around her, the hallway breathed back to life. Conversations resumed. Lockers opened and closed. She was visible now in Cassell, Montana, in a way she had never been before. She was the girl who had said no to a boss in public and survived the week. She was the girl the bikers were protecting. She was learning in those morning quarters that visibility was its own kind of weapon. She had not yet learned that it was also its own kind of target. That evening, Dale Voss sat behind his desk in the sheriff's office and listened to his son describe the morning's events with the expression of a man who has received bad news so many times that the arrival of more of it has become simply another administrative task. When Preston finished, Dale leaned back in his chair and looked at the window and the dark mountains beyond it. They're testing us, he said. The club comes in, puts their flag up, sees if we flinch. If we flinch, this town becomes theirs. If we don't, he looked at his son. They learn that Cassell already has ownership. So what do we do? Dale picked up his phone from the desk and held it for a moment without dialing. We remind this town, he said, what it costs to choose the wrong side. He made a call. His voice was quiet enough that Preston caught only fragments. A location at a time, a phrase that sounded like, make it clear. Preston felt something move through him that he would not have been able to name cleanly. Not quite pride, not quite unease. Something between them that he had been trained his whole life not to examine too closely. What are you going to do? He asked. His father looked at him with those pale eyes that never fully warmed to anything. What I've always done when someone forgets their place, Dale said, I teach a lesson that sticks. What Preston did not know, what Dale Voss had not shared with anyone except the two men he'd called that night, was that 3 days before the gymnasium, 3 days before the quarry, 3 days before any of it reached its end, Dale Voss had sat down with his personal attorney in a private office in Helena and recorded 47 minutes of everything he knew. His attorney had asked him why. Voss had looked out the window at the mountains and said insurance. The kind a man purchases when he begins to understand that the ground has started to shift beneath him in ways he cannot fully control. The recording was sealed with instructions to release it in the event of his death under any circumstances. His attorney had filed it and said nothing further. None of them knew about it yet. That knowledge would arrive later in the way that certain kinds of truth arrive not when you need it most, but when it can do the most damage to the people who most deserve it. At 3 in the morning, Delia's diner burned. Mara woke to the sound of her mother screaming her name from the other end of the trailer. She came out of bed already moving, found Delia at the window with her hands pressed to the glass, and looked past her and saw the orange light on the horizon 3 blocks away. Not sunrise too close, and too orange and moving wrong for sunrise. They ran outside in what they were wearing. Mara's feet found gravel and didn't register it. They ran the 3 blocks to Highway 12 and stopped at the parking lot edge and stood there together watching 11 years of everything her mother had built come down in heat and noise and light. The fire trucks came. The firefighters went through their motions. The faces of the men working the hoses had an expression Mara would analyze later when she had the distance for analysis. A professional vacancy, a careful not looking directly at her, that she would come to understand meant they knew, and knew they couldn't say they knew, and had made their peace with that knowing. By dawn, the diner was a skeleton of blackened studs and collapsed roofing, and one wall still standing where the kitchen had been. Someone had spray painted it before the smoke cleared. Keep your mouth shut. Red letters, 2 feet high. The same hand as the door, the same deliberate legibility of someone who wants to be understood clearly. Delia sank to her knees in the parking lot gravel. She didn't make a sound. She just went down as if something structural had given way inside her and put her hands flat on the cold ground and looked at what was left of everything Roy had helped her build. Mara stood beside her mother and did not sink. She felt the heat of the dying fire on her face and the cold of the October morning at her back, and looked at the painted wall and felt the rage move through her, like something geological, slow, inexorable, too large for any single moment to contain. A motorcycle rumbled into the parking lot. Cole Hunter climbed off his bike and walked toward them across the gravel, and he looked at the ruined diner and at Delia on her knees and at Mara standing with her face lit by the last of the fire, and his jaw tightened in a way that said everything he wasn't going to say out loud. "Get your mother," he told Mara. "Pack what you need. You're not staying here tonight." "Where?" "Somewhere the sheriff can't reach while we figure out the next move." Mara looked at him. "They did this to make us run." "I know. If we run—" "You're not running," Cole said. "You're regrouping. There's a difference. Running is what they want. What we're going to do is something else entirely." His voice dropped, and in it, Mara heard the same certainty she'd heard in her doorway 2 nights ago, the thing he did instead of making promises. "But I need you somewhere safe first. Can you trust me?" Mara looked at her mother's hands flat against the parking lot gravel. She looked at the painted wall. She looked at this man who had come back morning after morning for reasons she was only beginning to fully understand. "Yes," she said. Cole nodded once. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything about what came next. "It's me," he said. "I need everyone, not just local, everyone." A pause. "Because a man with a badge just burned down a widow's restaurant to scare a teenage girl into silence, and we're going to make sure the whole world knows what he did." He ended the call. In the distance, the last standing wall of Delia's diner settled with a sound like a long exhale. Mara reached down and took her mother's hands and helped her to her feet. They walked to Cole's truck together, mother and daughter, through the gravel and the smoke, in the first gray light of a Montana morning, and behind them the painted wall stood with its red letters bright against the char. "Keep your mouth shut." Mara did not look back at it. She was done being quiet. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the sound had already started. Mara heard it from inside the safe house, a converted equipment garage on a logging road 7 miles outside Cassell, owned by the club through a holding company whose name meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. The sound came first as vibration, something felt in the chest before it registered in the ears, and then it became unmistakable. Engines, dozens of them moving in convoy on the roads below, descending into Cassell from the north and the east and the south, like weather arriving from 3 directions at once. She stood at the single window that faced the tree line and watched the morning light and listened to the valley fill with that sound and felt something shift in her understanding of what was actually happening. Cole appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without speaking. "How many?" she said. "Enough." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it's not." He looked out the window. "Enough is the answer that matters, though." Delia was asleep on a cot in the back room. She had finally gone under around 4 in the morning after 2 hours of sitting at the folding table with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Not talking, just sitting with the weight of what the night had taken from her. Mara had watched her mother's eyes close and felt something complicated move through her relief. And underneath the relief, a grief she didn't have time for yet. Sarah and Rebecca, 2 women from the club's extended family who had driven 8 hours from Billings when Cole made his calls, had set up the cots and the propane heater and the makeshift kitchen area without being asked. They moved through the space with the efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before, who understood what it meant to make a place livable quickly and without ceremony. "Your mother's going to be all right," Sarah said to Mara, pouring coffee from a battered percolator. "She's stronger than she looks." "I know she is," Mara said. "She's been stronger than she looks for 3 years. Sarah glanced at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration, but held elements of both. "So have you, sounds like." Mara didn't answer that. She took her coffee back to the window and watched the light change on the tree line and thought about her father. Roy Sutton had been the kind of man who fixed things. Not just mechanically, though he was good with his hands and had kept their aging trailer functional through a combination of skill and stubbornness that Mara had always taken for granted. He fixed things in the broader sense. He was the person in any room who saw what was broken and moved toward it without making a production of the moving. He had done that at the mine. He had been a shift supervisor, which in practice meant he was the person the younger miners came to when something was wrong because Royce Sutton would listen and Royce Sutton would act, and Royce Sutton would not make you feel stupid for bringing the problem to him. In the weeks before the explosion at Black Ridge, he had been quieter than usual. Mara had been 14 and not paying the kind of attention that she would later wish she had paid. She remembered him at the kitchen table after dinner not reading or watching television the way he usually did, just sitting. She remembered her mother asking him something in a low voice and her father answering in a voice too quiet for Mara to catch from the hallway. She had not thought about those weeks in a long time. She thought about them now, standing at a window in a logging road garage, listening to the valley below, filled with motorcycle engines. Same people her mother had said, looking at Roy's photograph in the aftermath of the first broken window. Same silence. Mara had not understood it fully then. She was beginning to. Cole drove them back into Cassell at 10 in the morning, and the town they returned to was not the town Mara had grown up in. Motorcycles lined every main street 2 and 3 deep in places, their riders standing or sitting or leaning against storefronts with the particular stillness of people who are not planning to leave soon. Mara counted them through the truck window and gave up counting somewhere past 80. They had come from Great Falls and Billings and Missoula and places further still, men and women who had answered a call and driven through the night because the call had come from Cole Hunter, and Cole Hunter did not make that call lightly. The town watched from behind glass. Shop owners stood in their doorways and assessed. A group of men outside the hardware store tracked the truck with expressions that Mara categorized somewhere between hostile and frightened, which in her experience were essentially the same thing. Children pressed their faces to school bus windows as the bus moved slowly through a street it had to share now with things it hadn't shared it with yesterday. "They're afraid," Cole said, watching the hardware store men in his rear view. "Good," Mara said. He glanced at her. "Fear makes people dangerous. So does letting them think nothing will ever change." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly safe for driving, then returned his eyes to the road. Fair point. The town hall meeting was called for that evening. Emergency session convened by Mayor Gerald Pruitt, who was a thin man with the expression of someone perpetually being asked to sign something he hadn't read carefully enough. The notice went out through the city's alert system at noon community meeting regarding public safety concerns, all residents encouraged to attend. Mara read the alert on a borrowed phone. Cole had taken her own phone from her that morning and locked it in a metal box he kept under the truck seat. Something about Voss surveillance that he wasn't ready to discuss in detail yet, but wanted to interrupt as a precaution, and understood that public safety concerns meant the bikers, and the bikers meant her. And the meeting was essentially a mechanism for the town to vote on whether she deserved what was happening to her. "I want to go," she told Cole. "I know." "Are you going to tell me I can't?" "No." He didn't elaborate. Nora Fitch arrived at the safe house at 2 in the afternoon in a 10-year-old Subaru with a press credential hanging from the rear view and a recording device already running in her jacket pocket. She was 53 with steel gray hair cut practically short and eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had developed the particular quality of eyes that have seen too much and decided to keep looking anyway. She had been investigating corruption in rural Montana jurisdictions for 6 years. She had 3 sources in 3 different counties who had been feeding her pieces of a picture she hadn't been able to assemble completely because the pieces always seemed to connect back to the same place and the same name and the same refusal of the relevant authorities to discuss either. She sat across from Mara at the folding table and set her notepad down and said, "Tell me everything. Start from before the diner." Mara told her everything. It took 90 minutes. Nora did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not react visibly to anything. Not the quarry, not the brick, not the fire, not the nights they'd spent calculating how much was left in the register. She took notes in a shorthand Mara couldn't read and asked two clarifying questions, and at the end, sat back and looked at Mara with those well-used eyes. "There's something I want to show you tonight," Nora said. "At the meeting. I want you there when I show it." "What is it?" "Evidence." Nora glanced at Cole, who was standing near the door. "Video, authenticated this morning by two separate forensic analysts I trust." She looked back at Mara. "I received it anonymously 3 days ago. I didn't know what it was until I had it checked. Now I know what it is." "What does it show?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "It shows you didn't fight back alone at the quarry," she said carefully. "And it shows that someone who was present had a choice about whether to intervene, and chose not to." Mara absorbed this slowly. "He was there," she said. Nora didn't confirm or deny. "Be at the meeting tonight," she said. The town hall was a converted gymnasium attached to the community center on Birch Street. It held 300 people at capacity. By 6:30, it held 340, with more standing along the back wall and crowding the double doors that had been propped open to the parking lot, where another 100 or so stood listening through the gap. News cameras had arrived from 2 billing stations, one crew from a Great Falls outlet, a freelance videographer whose footage Mara would later learn ended up in 17 separate media packages. Mara walked in with Cole beside her and felt the room turn. Not all of it. Some people were looking at their phones, some were talking to neighbors, but enough of it, a significant enough portion of 340 people, that the weight of the attention was a physical thing she had to walk through like resistance. Mayor Pruitt called the meeting to order from the podium with the expression of a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else. He spoke about community cohesion and public safety concerns and the importance of dialogue in difficult times. And while he spoke, Sheriff Dale Voss stood along the side wall in his full-dress uniform, with his badge catching the gymnasium light and his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes moving slowly around the room in a way that reminded Mara of something she couldn't name for a moment, and then could. He was counting. He was assessing. He was doing what he had been doing in this town for 24 years, calculating where the weight was, who was where, what the room would bear. He had not, Mara noticed, looked directly at her yet. When Pruitt opened the floor, Voss spoke first. He walked to the podium with the unhurried authority of a man who has never had to ask for a room's attention because rooms have always given it to him. And he stood there and looked out at 340 people who had lived under his jurisdiction for varying portions of their lives, and spoke about the club and the disruption and the outside elements who had inserted themselves into Cassell's affairs under the guise of protection. He spoke about Mara. He did not use her name. He referred to her as a troubled young woman with a documented history of behavioral issues at school. And when Mara heard those words, she felt the heat move up her face, but she kept her hands flat on her thighs and her back straight and her eyes on the podium. He spoke about the stress on local businesses from the presence of so many outsiders. He spoke about the motorcycle club's known criminal associations. He spoke with the practiced fluency of a man who has been the most trusted voice in a room for so long that the trust has become structural, built into the walls, load-bearing, not something you question, because questioning it would mean questioning the building itself. "I've served this town for 24 years, he said. "I've kept you safe. I've kept crime manageable. And now, because of allegations made by one, those allegations are true." The room went still in a different way than it had gone still before. Mara was standing. She hadn't decided to stand. Her body had made the decision and her voice had followed. She stood in the middle of the seated crowd, and Dale Voss looked at her for the first time since she'd entered the gymnasium, and the look was the thing she had spent 3 years learning to avoid cold and assessing, and utterly without warmth, and she held it. "Every word I said is true," she said. "Your son and his friends attacked me. You sent deputies to cover for them. You let my mother's calls go unanswered, and you burned her restaurant." The room erupted. Multiple conversations at once, voices rising and cross-cutting, and a man near the front shouting something Mara couldn't make out. Pruitt banged for order. Voss waited with his hands at his sides, patient as stone. "Young lady," Voss said when the noise had subsided enough for his voice to carry, "I understand you've been through a difficult time, but making accusations without evidence. I have a question for Sheriff Voss." Nora Fitch had stood up from her seat near the back. She was small enough that standing barely made her more visible, but her voice carried with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be heard in rooms that didn't want to hear her. "The floor isn't open," Pruitt started. "I have video," Nora said. "Authenticated this morning. I'd like the room to see it before this meeting concludes." She looked at Pruitt directly. "I'd like that very much, Mayor. I think the residents of Cassell would as well." The room made a sound, not words, just a collective shifting, a reorientation of attention. Pruitt looked at Voss. Voss's expression had not changed, which was itself, Mara thought, a kind of change. "5 minutes," Pruitt said. Nora connected her phone to the gymnasium's projector with a cable she'd brought herself, with the preparedness of someone who had learned not to rely on the available equipment. The screen at the front of the room lit up. The footage was dark, shot from a distance, shaky, the kind of video that phone cameras produce at the outer limit of their capability. For the first few seconds, Mara didn't understand what she was looking at. Shapes in darkness, movement that resolved slowly into people, into the specific geography of the quarry on the south edge of town. The rock face and the flat ground before it, and the dark water beyond. Then she understood what she was watching. She recognized the quarry. She recognized the figures, Preston and Harlan and Riker and Grady Fenn, their shapes unmistakable even in the dark footage, the way they moved, the way they occupied space. She recognized the smaller figure at the center who went down and stayed down. She recognized herself. She hadn't known anyone was filming that night. She had never known. The room had gone absolutely silent. The footage continued, and then at the edge of the frame, barely resolved a figure that had been stationary throughout, standing at a distance, positioned where the light from the quarry road reached. The darkness shifted, turned slightly, and was recognizable to anyone who had lived in Cassell long enough by posture alone. Someone in the room gasped, a single sharp sound. Nora paused the footage. "That's you in the background, Sheriff," she said. Her voice was steady and professional and carried no triumph, just the flat accuracy of someone stating a confirmed fact. "The footage has been geotagged, time-stamped, and authenticated by 2 independent forensic analysts who will make themselves available to federal investigators. You were present at the quarry the night your son and his friends assaulted a 17-year-old girl. You watched. You did nothing." The silence held for 2 more seconds. Then the gymnasium came apart. Mara couldn't track individual voices in what followed. It was noise as a single entity, 340 people's responses to what they had just seen colliding and amplifying. A man near the front stood and started shouting toward the podium. 2 women near Mara were crying. The cameras at the back of the room swung toward Voss, who had not moved from beside the podium, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his expression doing something Mara had never seen on that face before, a kind of controlled fracturing the surface holding, while something structural shifted underneath. Pruitt banged the podium repeatedly. "Order, I need order right now. Nobody leaves this building." Voss's voice cut through the noise. Not loud, just absolute. His deputies materialized from 3 positions around the gymnasium perimeter, moving to the exits with the coordination of people who had been briefed on their positions in advance. The double doors at the back swung toward closed. The screaming started in the sections nearest the exits. Cole was beside Mara before she fully registered the movement. His hand closed on her arm, not grabbing, just present, directional. "Stay with me," he said low and close. "Don't move toward any exit. Stay in the center of the room." What is he doing? Trying to control what leaves this building tonight. Cole was scanning the room over her head. The cameras are the problem for him. As long as those cameras are running, he can't do what he actually wants to do. Mara looked at the cameras. Their operators were still filming, some of them retreating toward the walls, none of them lowering their equipment. Voss walked toward the podium. He moved through the chaos with his hand on his holster, not drawing, not threatening, just making the presence of the gun a fact that the room was aware of. "This meeting is over," he said. "Everyone go home. We will address these allegations through appropriate legal channels." The appropriate legal channel is a federal investigation. Nora Fitch again, standing in the same spot, unmoved by the chaos around her, with her notepad in her hand and her recorder running. "Ms. Fitch, I filed a report with the FBI field office in Helena this morning," Nora said, "before this meeting. The footage and supporting documentation have already been transmitted. Whatever happens in this room tonight, that process has already begun." Voss stared at her. Then he did something that Mara had not anticipated, that the room had not anticipated. That would be the image that ran on every news broadcast that covered what happened in Cassell that night. He drew his weapon and pointed it at the ceiling and fired once. The sound in an enclosed gymnasium was enormous. The screaming that followed was different from the noise that had preceded it. Higher, more uniform, the specific register of genuine fear. People dropped to the floor. Others stampeded toward the exits. A folding chair went over, then another. Someone fell in the surge. Cole threw himself in front of Mara. She looked past him and saw Preston Voss, who had been sitting in the front row for the entire meeting and had not moved during any of it, now on his feet and moving through the chaos toward her with an expression that she would afterward describe to Agent Morrow as the most frightening thing she had seen throughout the entire preceding weeks. Not rage, something colder, something that had been decided before he walked through the door. "Cole." She grabbed his arm. "Preston." Cole turned. Preston was 15 feet away and closing. What happened next occupied approximately 4 seconds. Preston threw a punch. Cole caught his wrist and redirected it with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, and Preston made a sound and went to one knee. Voss turned from the podium with his weapon still drawn, and for one suspended moment had it pointed at Cole's head. 3 members of the club who had been stationed in various parts of the gymnasium converged on Voss simultaneously. And then there were bodies in motion, and the cameras were capturing everything from 3 angles, and the gymnasium was in full and total chaos. Mara stood in the center of it and did not move. She was looking at her own hands, which were not shaking. She noticed this with a clarity that felt strange given everything happening around her, the stillness in her own hands while the room broke apart. She thought, this is what comes after fear. Not courage, just the absence of surprise. She had known this was coming. She had known it since Friday night in the diner. Voss's voice, once more cutting through noise that it shouldn't have been able to cut through. "Enough." Another shot into the ceiling. The gymnasium went still. Voss stood near the podium with his weapon in his hand, and his uniform torn at one shoulder, and blood from his nose catching the light. His deputies had re-established the exits. Cole and his brothers had stepped back. Preston was on his feet, cradling his wrist, his face carrying the specific expression of someone trying to decide how much pain to acknowledge. The cameras were still running. "Everyone out," Voss said. His voice was no longer controlled in the way it had been at the start of the evening. It was controlled in a different way, the way of something being held by will alone with the seams showing. "Now this is over." People moved toward the exits. The gymnasium emptied in under 2 minutes, 340 people, becoming a memory of noise and displacement, leaving behind overturned chairs and a room that smelled like gunpowder, and the specific residue of a place where something has broken that can't be fixed. Mara Cordelia, Nora Fitch, a handful of club members, and Preston Voss remained, and Dale Voss, who had not moved from beside the podium. He looked at Mara across the empty gymnasium. Really looked at her for the first time that evening, not the calculating inventory he'd been performing all night, but something directional and specific and very cold. "This isn't over," he said. "You think a video changes 24 years? You think these people, a gesture at Cole and his brothers, will still be here when the courts have finished with this? When the appeals have run and the investigations have stalled and the news cycle has moved on?" He shook his head slowly. You're a 17-year-old girl from a trailer on the east side, and I am this town. I have been this town since before you were born. Mara walked toward the podium. Cole moved to follow, and she held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. She walked until she was 10 feet from Dale Voss and stopped there. Then arrest me, she said. He stared at her. Right now, in front of those cameras. She didn't look at the cameras. She kept her eyes on his. Charge me with whatever you think I've done wrong, because the moment you put handcuffs on me tonight after what this room just watched on that screen, the FBI doesn't close the investigation. It expands it. Every agency that's been too polite to look at Cassell for the last 2 decades looks at it. Every file in your office becomes evidence in a federal proceeding. She held his gaze. Or you walk away tonight, and you deal with what's coming. But you do not get to keep pretending that what this town just saw doesn't mean what it means. The gymnasium was silent enough to hear the fluorescent lights humming. Voss looked at her for a long time. Then he laughed. The same cold sound she'd heard in rooms and hallways and parking lots her whole life. The sound of a man who has been laughed at so rarely that laughter has remained entirely his to deploy. I'm going to remember this moment, he said, when everything you think you've built falls apart. When these bikers are facing federal charges of their own and your mother can't afford a lawyer, and whatever federal investigation your reporter friend thinks she started has been quietly reassigned to someone who understands how things work in this state. He picked up his hat from the podium. I'm going to remember standing here and watching you think you'd won. He walked out through the gymnasium side exit. His deputies followed. The room breathed. Preston had not followed his father. He stood near the front row of overturned chairs, his injured wrist held against his chest, his face carrying an expression Mara hadn't seen there before. Not the cold calculation of the hallway, not the performance of the town hall entrance, but something younger and more lost. Like a person who has watched a structure they believed in fail a test it shouldn't have failed. He looked at Mara. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He left through the main doors. We need to move, Cole said. He was already on his phone moving toward her. Right now, the safe house location may be compromised. I haven't determined the vector yet, but I want to assume it until I know differently. They moved through the side exit into the night. The parking lot was still half-full clusters of people who hadn't gone home yet, standing in the sodium light talking fast and checking their phones. News vans were staged along the street. Someone had set up a live stream that was already, Nora Fitch told them, as they passed her in the parking lot approaching 50,000 simultaneous viewers. In Cole's truck moving through Cassell's streets with 2 club vehicles behind them, Mara's borrowed phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She opened it. A video loaded, 15 seconds long. Shot from outside a structure she recognized after a moment as the original safe house, the equipment garage on the logging road. The angle suggested a camera positioned in the tree line trained on the building's single window. The timestamp in the corner was from 4 nights ago. The message beneath the video read, "We know where you are. We've always known where you are. We're watching." Mara stared at the screen, Cole's voice from the driver's seat. What is it? She held the phone up. He glanced at it, his jaw set. We're going somewhere else, he said. He made a call on his own phone, 2 words, then ended it and drove. They went for an hour on roads that stopped being paved after the first 20 minutes. Branches scraped the truck. The headlights found only trees and the muddy track between them. Delia sat beside Mara and held her hand and did not ask where they were going. The second garage was smaller, deeper in the timber with no visible approach from any road. Cole parked and came around to open the door. 3 people know about this place, he said. Me, my VP, and my sergeant-at-arms. It's not in any document the club keeps. It was never used for anything. It was just a place. They went inside. Supplies, water blankets, a propane heater. Spare and cold, but sealed against the dark outside. I'm going back to town, Cole said. There's someone I need to talk to about that video. Who sent it? I have a suspicion. He looked at Mara directly, and she read in that look a kind of controlled anger she hadn't seen from him before. Not performed, not for her benefit, just real. I'll be back before morning. If anything moves outside that door, you don't open it for anyone but me. He left. Mara sat in the cold dark with her mother and listened to the truck's engine fade into the timber, and the silence that followed was so complete she could hear the trees. Baby, Delia said after a while. Don't apologize, Mara said. A pause. I was going to. I know. Don't. Mara leaned against her mother's shoulder. You didn't do anything wrong. You built something for 11 years and someone decided it threatened them. That's not on you. Delia was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about your father. Mara said nothing. He used to say that the hardest thing wasn't the work, Delia continued. It was knowing when the work mattered enough to risk what you'd built to do it right. She paused. I think he knew something was wrong at the mine. I think he knew it and was trying to figure out what to do about it. Mom, I know we don't. No. Mara sat up. I think you're right. I've been thinking the same thing. They looked at each other in the propane heater's dim light. Same people, Mara said. Delia's eyes filled. She nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they've arrived at something they've been approaching for a long time without knowing it. Then we finish it, Mara said. Whatever it takes, we finish all of it. Cole returned at 4 in the morning with news that clarified several things at once. He sat down at the makeshift table and put his hands flat on it, and looked at Mara with the expression he used when what he was about to say was going to cost him something to say. The video was taken by Grady Fenn, he said. He's been watching both locations, the first garage, the trailer, before that for 3 weeks. Taking photos, video, audio when he could get close enough. Mara felt her stomach move. For Preston. No. Cole paused. He was paid by someone outside the county. Someone with a state government email address who has been communicating with him through a platform that isn't quite as private as Grady thought. Who? A man named Gerald Strom, Deputy Attorney General, State of Montana. Cole watched her face. He's been paying Grady Fenn to document your contact with the club, your movements, your conversations. The working theory is that he wanted to build a case for criminal conspiracy charges, frame the club for coercing a minor discredit everything you've said. Mara was silent for a moment. Strom, she said. The State Attorney General's office. Deputy AG, yes. So Voss isn't. Voss is the local piece, Cole said. Strom is something bigger. Whatever Voss has been doing in Cassell for 24 years, someone above him has been making sure the right investigations don't gain traction, making sure complaints get lost, making sure people who look too closely at this county find themselves reassigned or discouraged or worse. Mara thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table in the days before the explosion, about the quietness that had settled over him, about the conversation her mother said she'd never been able to hear clearly. Grady Fenn, she said. Where is he now? Having a conversation with my VP about his choices. Cole's expression didn't change. He'll be available to make a statement to federal investigators. And Strom, that's what we need to figure out. Cole looked at her steadily, because bringing down Strom is not the same as bringing down Voss. Voss is a county sheriff. Strom has resources and connections and the institutional protection of a state office. Bringing him down requires something airtight, something he can't maneuver around. Mara nodded slowly. Then we get it, she said. Cole studied her. It won't be simple. Nothing about this has been simple. I mean, it'll require you to take another risk, to put yourself out there in a way that might bring him to you, and then you have to be ready for what he does when he comes. Mara looked at the propane heater's glow. She thought about her father. She thought about the painted wall and the red letters and the 11 years of photographs that had burned. She thought about Roy at the kitchen table sitting in a quietness that she now understood had been the quietness of a man trying to decide whether the right thing required him to risk everything he had. He had decided yes, and it had cost him everything. She was his daughter. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. They drove back toward Cassell as the first gray light was coming up, and Mara watched the timber give way to the outskirts of a town that was going to have to decide what it was, and felt the shape of what was coming take form in her mind, not frightening exactly, or not only frightening, but something she was walking toward rather than away from. That distinction she was learning made all the difference. She was still learning it when Cole's phone rang. He answered, listened. His expression shifted, the subtle version of the shift she'd learned to read, the one that meant the situation had changed in a way that required immediate response. "When," he said, "and then how many?" He ended the call and looked at the road. "What?" Mara said. "Preston Voss just posted something on social media." He handed her his phone. 20 minutes ago. Mara looked at the screen. The video was 40 seconds long. Preston sat in the cab of his truck. She recognized the interior with something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Raw and young and frightened in a way he had never allowed himself to be in front of anyone. In the video, Preston said, "I can't keep lying to protect my father." Mara Sutton was telling the truth. Every single thing she said was true. He ordered the fire. He was there at the quarry. He's been covering up things for years, and he told me if I ever... The video cut off. A second video had been posted from the same account 30 seconds later. It showed Preston's truck parked at the edge of the quarry. Driver's door open. Truck empty. The caption read, "I'm sorry for everything. I can't live with what we did." Mara looked at Cole. "It's a trap," she said. "Yes," he said. He was already accelerating. "It is." She looked at the quarry video on the screen again, the empty truck, the open door, the water dark beyond the lot's edge, and understood what was happening with a cold, complete clarity. Dale Voss was not finished. He had just changed tactics. And somewhere in that dark Preston Voss was either already past help or waiting to be used as the mechanism by which everyone who had been protecting Mara would be drawn out and neutralized at once. Cole was on the radio before she finished the thought, his voice clipped and urgent, calling in positions, calling in vehicles. Mara held the phone with Preston's empty truck on the screen and felt the night contracting around them as they drove toward the quarry with the convoy forming behind them. Headlights in the mirror multiplying the sound of engines filling the valley from 3 directions. She was not afraid. That was what she noticed. After everything, the fire and the brick and the spyware and the gymnasium and all the dark miles since she sat in this truck moving toward a trap, she could see clearly, and she was not afraid. She was angry. And underneath the anger, something that had been building for 3 years without a name finally had one. She was ready. The quarry was dark and wrong in the way that places are wrong when something human has arranged them to deceive. Cole killed the headlights 200 yards out, and they rolled the last stretch on momentum and gravel crunch the convoy behind them, doing the same in a ripple of darkness, moving across the landscape like a held breath. Mara looked through the windshield and saw Preston's truck exactly where the video had shown it. Driver's door standing open dome-like, casting a pale yellow rectangle onto the ground beside it. The quarry water black and still beyond. No Preston. Cole had his hand on the door before they fully stopped. He looked at Mara and Delia. "Stay. Lock the doors. If anything moves wrong, you drive straight to the FBI field office, and you do not stop." He looked at Mara specifically. "Promise me." "Go find him," Mara said. He went. The club spread out from the vehicles in practiced silence, moving into the dark around the quarry perimeter with flashlights and radios, and the specific efficiency of people who have done dangerous things in dark places before and understood the mechanics of it. Mara watched through the windshield, her hand on the door lock, her eyes tracking each moving light. Delia sat beside her and said nothing. She had been saying nothing for the last 20 minutes in the particular way that meant she was holding herself together by a margin she didn't want to test with words. Then Mara's borrowed phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She opened it. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, the way images load on weak signals in mountain valleys, and Mara watched it resolve from abstraction into something recognizable and felt the blood leave her face. Preston Voss hanging from a tree branch at the quarry's far edge. Rope, purple face, eyes that had gone wrong. The message beneath it read, "Your fault. All of this is your fault. You killed him." Delia looked at the screen. Her hand flew to her mouth. Then Cole's voice crackled through on the radio frequency. The borrowed phone was also monitoring, and his voice was level and immediate and said, "Found him. He's alive. Repeat, Preston is alive." This was staged. Northeast tree line, he's restrained but breathing. Delia made a sound Mara had never heard from her mother before and never wanted to hear again. Mara stared at the image on the phone. The staged image, the constructed tableau, the photograph that had been designed to do exactly what it had done, which was to produce a specific response in the person who saw it, and felt something cold and analytical move through the adrenaline. If it was staged, if Preston was alive and restrained in the tree line. Then someone had arranged this quickly. The video, the truck, the photograph, and the person who had arranged it was not Preston. Preston was the prop. The production belonged to someone else, and that someone had sent the photograph to Mara specifically. Not to Cole, not to Nora Fitch, not to the FBI, to Mara. Because the photograph was not the point. The photograph was the distraction. She said, "Mom, get down," and the headlights came. 6 of them at least from the road that approached the quarry from the south, vehicles moving fast with no warning, no deceleration, and the first one hit a parked club vehicle 20 feet ahead of Cole's truck, with a sound that was less like a collision and more like a termination. Metal meeting metal at speed with the specific finality of something that cannot be undone. Then the doors were opening and the men were coming out, and they had baseball bats and lengths of chain and crowbars, and they moved toward the motorcycles and the club vehicles with the organized intent of people who had been briefed on their targets in advance. This was not improvisation. This had been planned. Mara watched through the windshield as the quarry became chaos, shouting, and the sound of breaking glass and metal on metal, and Cole's voice on the radio cutting through all of it with instructions she couldn't fully parse. A masked man hit one motorcycle with a crowbar, and the headlight exploded. Another was swinging a length of chain in a wide arc that kept anyone from approaching. Then a shape appeared at the passenger window, a masked man reaching for the door handle. The handle moved. Mara lunged across to the driver's seat before the door opened, her hands finding the key that Cole had left in the ignition. Not an oversight, she understood now, a provision. And she turned it, and the engine came up, and she put the truck in reverse and floored it. The truck shot backward. The man at the window grabbed air. "Mara!" Delia's voice half frightened and half something else. "I know." Mara had her eyes on the rear view. Another vehicle was trying to block from the north. She cranked the wheel left and went off the gravel entirely, the truck bouncing and crashing over rough ground, scrub brush scraping the undercarriage, and she felt the rear end slide on wet grass and corrected it by instinct, by some reflex she didn't know she had, and they crashed back onto the access road 50 yards south of the chaos, and she accelerated. "You don't have a license," Delia said. "I'm aware of that." She drove. The road straightened and she found the headlight switch and got them on, and the night opened up ahead of her, the road south toward Cassell, the mountains on both sides, the valley in between. She checked the mirror. One vehicle had turned to follow. She watched its headlights in the glass and felt her jaw set. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it. It buzzed again. Delia reached over and picked it up. Her face in the dashboard light went through something Mara couldn't fully read. She held the phone up so Mara could see it in her peripheral vision. The caller ID on the borrowed phone read, "Sheriff Voss." Mara looked at the road, looked at the mirror. The following vehicle was dropping back. Another club truck had inserted itself between them, running interference. She reached over and took the phone from her mother and answered it. "Hello, Mara." The voice was the same voice from every town hall and public statement an official capacity encounter she'd had with Dale Voss for 17 years. Calm, unhurried, certain of its own authority. "You're doing about 70 in a 65 zone on the county road heading south," Voss said. "That's reckless driving. I could have a deputy pull you over right now, charge you with operating a vehicle without a license. Your mother for aiding and abetting." A brief pause. "I won't, though." Mara said nothing. "I want you to keep driving," Voss said. "Drive south. Drive to the county line. Drive to the state line, if that's what it takes. Because here's what I'm offering you tonight, Mara. One time this offer, and then it's gone. You leave Cassell, you and your mother, permanently. You tell the FBI you exaggerated that you were frightened and made poor choices, and the club influenced your account. And all of this stops." The road unreeled ahead of her in the headlights. "He's been listening to everything," Delia said quietly, not alarmed, just acknowledging a fact that had just become real. Every call, Voss confirmed with the casualness of a man who has long since stopped distinguishing between surveillance and ownership. Every conversation with the reporter, every conversation with the federal agents, every plan you've made in the last 3 weeks. The spyware on your original phone gave me the microphone, the camera, the location data. A pause. "And that borrowed phone you're using now, it belonged to one of my deputies before Cole Hunter handed it to you. I've had eyes on it since the moment it changed hands. I've known every move before you made it, which is how I knew to send those men to the quarry tonight, which is how I knew exactly what that photograph would do to you." Mara's hands were steady on the wheel. "And if I don't leave," she said, "then tomorrow morning your mother is found in a ditch on the highway. Drug overdose. A tragedy. A woman who couldn't handle the pressure of what her daughter put their family through." His voice didn't change register. "And you spend the rest of your life knowing that the choice you made tonight is what caused it." The silence on the line was the worst kind. The silence of a man who is not bluffing, who has made this kind of calculation before and is familiar with its contours. Mara looked at the road, looked at her mother in the seat beside her. Delia was looking back at her. In the dashboard light, her mother's face held something that Mara recognized from 100 mornings in the diner, 100 evenings counting the register, 100 moments of choosing to keep going when the argument for stopping was reasonable and real. It was the expression Roy Sutton had apparently worn when he understood what was wrong at the mine and began trying to figure out what to do about it. Stubbornness was the simple word for it, but it was stubbornness of a particular kind, the kind that has calculated the cost and decided the cost is acceptable. Mara said into the phone, "I know about Gerald Strom." The silence on the other end changed quality. "I know he's been paying Grady Fenn," Mara continued. "I know about his connection to Harwell Energy. I know about the payments. And I know that what happened to my father at Blackridge wasn't an accident." Her voice was steady. She didn't know where the steadiness was coming from exactly, only that it was there, and she intended to use it. "So here's what's going to happen, Sheriff. You're going to drive back to your office, and you're going to think very carefully about whether the offer you just made me is still the right move, given what the FBI is going to find out about Strom and Harwell and the mine. And you're going to realize that the answer is no, because this is already too big for you to bury." She ended the call. Her hands began shaking approximately 4 seconds later, which she noted with a detached interest as the point at which adrenaline and will part company. Delia reached over and put both of her hands over Mara's on the steering wheel. They drove the remaining miles to the FBI field office in silence, and the mountains held them on both sides in the dark, and Mara Sutton drove through all of it, with her mother's hands over hers and her father's name in her chest, like something she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing the weight of it until now. Agent Dwight Morrow had commandeered a conference room in the Cassell County Courthouse, the FBI's temporary operational center established 48 hours earlier, when the investigation had expanded beyond what a field agent working alone could manage. When Mara and Delia arrived, Nora Fitch was already there. and Cole arrived 11 minutes later with Preston Voss pale shaking a rope burn on his neck that hadn't fully resolved in three of his brothers. Preston sat down heavily in a chair at the table's far end. When he looked at Mara, he flinched and then held the look the way a person holds a look when they've decided they owe someone the discomfort of not looking away. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was wrecked. "I need you to know that I understand that word doesn't do anything, but I'm sorry." Mara looked at him for a long moment, at this boy who had filmed her being hurt and laughed and organized the weeks that followed with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been taught that cruelty had consequences, who had also tonight been tied to a tree by his own father to be used as a mechanism in a plan that had never included his survival if things went differently. "Tell them everything," she said. "That's what matters right now." Agent Morrow's team had been listening to the recording of Voss's phone call. The borrowed phone had a federal monitoring application installed on it that Morrow had put there 3 days earlier without fully explaining its purpose to Mara, which she would have feelings about later, but which had just produced the clearest piece of evidence yet gathered in the investigation. The call establishes intent conspiracy to commit witness tampering and direct threats against a protected witness, Morrow told the room. He was a compact man in his 40s with a methodical manner and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been working on too little sleep for too long. Combined with Preston's testimony and the Fenn documentation, we have enough for federal charges against Voss tonight. "And Strom," Cole said. "Strom is more complicated." Morrow looked at Mara. "You mentioned him on the call. He heard you say the name." "I know. That means he's aware we have something. He'll be making calls right now, destroying what he can, moving what he can move." Morrow paused. "We need to accelerate the timeline on Strom significantly. If he believes you're about to go public with what you know, he'll either run or he'll attempt to eliminate the threat." He looked at Mara over his glasses. "By which I mean you." The room was quiet for a moment. "So let him try," Mara said. Everyone looked at her. "I mean that," she said. "If we post something public, something that says, 'I have evidence connecting Strom to Voss, into Harwell Energy, into the mine,' and we let him hear about it, and we record whatever he does next." She looked at Morrow. "That's how you get him. You let him come to me." Morrow studied her. "You understand what you'd be volunteering for." "I'm already in it. I've been in it since Friday night in my mother's diner." She glanced at Cole, who was watching her with an expression she had learned to read as the closest thing he allowed himself to pride. "Tell me what the post needs to say." At 2 in the morning, Mara Sutton posted to her public social media account, which had acquired in the preceding week 460,000 followers, a statement that was 2 paragraphs long and had been carefully constructed with Morrow and Nora Fitch over the preceding 90 minutes. It said in essence that she had uncovered evidence connecting the corruption in Cassell to a senior official in the Montana state government, that the evidence included financial records, communications, and documentation related to multiple incidents, including one that had directly affected her family 3 years earlier, that she intended to share this evidence publicly within 48 hours. She posted it and put the phone down and sat in the courthouse conference room and waited. Gerald Strom called at 3:47 in the morning. Morrow's team had the phone set up before the call came, recording on 3 separate systems. The number traced and confirmed everything, documented with the procedural thoroughness of people who understood that what was recorded in the next few minutes would be played in a federal courtroom. Mara answered. "Miss Sutton?" The voice was smooth, deliberate, with the particular polish of someone who has spent decades speaking to people who didn't want to hear what he was saying and had learned to make the delivery frictionless. "My name is Gerald Strom. I'm with the Montana Attorney General's office." "I know who you are," Mara said. A brief pause, not discomfort, she thought, just recalibration. "Then you understand that some of the allegations you appear to be preparing to make are serious. Serious enough that they could constitute defamation of a public official. Serious enough that I would strongly encourage you to consult with an attorney before you proceed." "I have an attorney," Mara said. This was true. Morrow had arranged one 40 minutes earlier. "Good. Then I hope your attorney is advising you to consider the consequences of making false allegations against someone in my position. The legal consequences, certainly, but also a pause weighted with specific intent. The personal consequences. You've already been through a great deal. Your family has been through a great deal. It would be a shame for that to continue. There it was. The same architecture as Voss's call, built from different materials, but shaped the same way: the smooth surface, the implied threat beneath it, the assumption that 17-year-old girls from trailer parks on the east side of dying towns could be frightened into silence by the right voice using the right words. Mara thought of her father at the kitchen table. "Mr. Strom," she said, "I want to make sure I understand your position. Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you. Because what I'm hearing," Mara continued, keeping her voice level, "is that a senior official in the Montana state government called me at 4 in the morning to warn me against sharing evidence that connects him to a corrupt sheriff, an illegal surveillance operation, and a mining company that caused my father's death and paid to cover it up." She paused. "I want to make sure the record is clear on what this call is." Another pause, longer this time. When Strom spoke again, his voice had shed the smooth surface, and what was underneath it was not cold, the way Voss had been cold, but frightened in a way that Voss fundamentally had never been, because Voss had believed in his own power to the end. Strom understood now that the power he'd been borrowing had just been recalled. "Whatever you think you have, I have enough," Mara said, "and so do the federal agents who have been recording this call." She ended it. Morrow was already on his radio. The arrest of Gerald Strom happened at 6:15 in the morning at his home in Helena, conducted by federal marshals who had been staged and waiting since 4:30. The arrest of Dale Voss happened simultaneously at the county hospital, where he had gone to have his nose broken during the gymnasium altercation examined. Voss was handcuffed to a hospital gurney. Mara learned this detail later and found she had no particular feeling about it, which itself felt like a kind of feeling. What she also learned later from Morrow, delivered in the hallway outside the conference room, with the careful pacing of a man who understands that some information needs to be given slowly, was what had been found in Dale Voss's office safe during the search that followed his arrest. Preston Voss gave his testimony to Agent Morrow over 6 hours starting at 7 in the morning, pausing twice and producing a documented record that covered 21 separate incidents of criminal conduct by his father over the preceding decade, including 4 incidents of evidence tampering, 2 of witness intimidation, 3 involving coordination with Strom's office to suppress state-level investigations, and 1 that concerned a meeting that had taken place at the Black Ridge Mine Administrative Office 18 months before the explosion. Roy Sutton's name appeared in that last incident's documentation. Mara was not in the room when Preston gave that particular testimony. She was in the hallway outside, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and Delia was beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Delia said, "He knew what was wrong. He was going to do something about it." "I know. They killed him for it." Mara breathed through that sentence, let it move through her and settle into the place where the other heavy things had settled, the place that had been building since Friday night and was large enough now that she had stopped trying to measure it. "They did," she said, "and we're going to make sure that's part of what they answer for." Agent Morrow came out of the conference room at 1 in the afternoon with the expression of a man carrying more information than he'd expected to be carrying. He sat down in the hallway across from them. "The mine," he said. "Preston has documentation. Communications between Strom's office and Harwell Energy's legal team going back 4 years before the explosion. There was a scheme coordinated between Harwell, Strom, and Voss to acquire land in this valley at distressed prices. The mine families were the obstacle." He paused. "The explosion was not an accident. There is enough documentation to open a federal homicide investigation." Delia made a sound Mara had never heard from her mother before. Mara put her arm around Delia's shoulders and held on. "Roy Sutton. Morrow said will be named as a victim in that investigation. His name will be in the public record. What he knew and what he tried to do about it will be part of the case." They sat in the hallway for another hour while the federal machinery moved around them. Mara heard phones and footsteps and radio communications and the specific sound of a large institutional structure responding to new information. 17 people would be arrested before the week was out, she would learn later. 3 state senators, 2 judges, multiple officials across 4 agencies who had collectively maintained for over a decade a silence that had cost Roy Sutton and 2 other men their lives. All of it tracing back to a Friday afternoon in a diner when a 17-year-old girl had gotten tired of being invisible. The arrest produced the national story that Nora Fitch had been working toward for 6 years without ever having had enough pieces to build it completely. The story broke on a Thursday morning, and by that afternoon had been picked up by every major outlet in the country. The footage from the gymnasium and the authenticated quarry video, and Mara's recorded conversations with both Voss and Strom running in continuous rotation on screens from Montana to the eastern seaboard. Mara watched some of it and then stopped watching. She didn't feel like a story. She felt like a girl who was very tired and wanted a cup of coffee in a place that smelled like the diner used to smell before the fire, and that place didn't exist yet. Cole found her on the courthouse steps that afternoon, sitting in the thin November sunlight, with her face tilted up and her eyes closed. He sat down beside her. FBI cleared the club, he said. Morrow confirmed it an hour ago. No basis for the conspiracy angle. They've closed that inquiry. Good, Mara said. We're going to keep helping with the diner rebuild, if that's all right with you and your mother. You know it is. He was quiet for a moment. The sounds of Cassell came and went, traffic voices somewhere down the block, the sound of a radio playing something Mara couldn't identify. How are you doing? Cole said. She considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to consider questions from Cole, who asked them because he wanted the actual answer. I don't know yet, she said. I think I won't know for a while. That's reasonable. My father... She stopped, started again. My father tried to do what was right, and nobody protected him. Nobody stood next to him. No. And now... She opened her eyes and looked at the street in front of the courthouse, at the ordinary November light on an ordinary dying town that was in the process of becoming something else, something it hadn't been before. Now all of this, because I got tired of staying quiet. A pause. I keep thinking about whether it makes up for anything, whether it means he didn't die for nothing, and I can't land on an answer. Cole was quiet for a long time. A motorcycle passed on the street below the courthouse steps. He watched it go. Some things, he finally said, don't resolve into meaning cleanly. They just are what they are. Roy Sutton tried to do right and paid for it. That's a true thing. And his daughter refused to stay quiet and brought down the people who killed him. That's also a true thing. They're both true at the same time, and you don't have to make them add up to a lesson. Mara thought about that for a long moment. He would have been proud of you, Cole said. I didn't know him, but I know that much. She didn't say anything. She sat in the November sunlight on the courthouse steps and let that settle into the large place where the heavy things lived, and it joined the rest without displacing any of it, which was maybe how it was supposed to work. The diner reconstruction began 5 days after the arrests and took 3 weeks. Cole's club provided labor lumber equipment. Volunteers arrived daily, some from Cassell, some from places hours away. People who had seen the story on the news and driven to participate in something they couldn't fully explain. A retired contractor from Billings showed up on day 2 and didn't leave until the roof was finished. A woman from Great Falls brought her adult children in a truck full of donated kitchen equipment. Mara worked alongside all of them. She hauled debris and swung hammers and ran extension cords and mixed concrete and did every physical task available to her because the physical task kept her in her body, and in her body she was less susceptible to the ambient noise of being Mara Sutton the story, rather than Mara Sutton the person who needed to figure out what came next. Because the noise was considerable, 4 television interview requests had come in and been declined. A book agent had contacted Nora Fitch on her behalf and been referred to Mara directly and been told she'd think about it. A documentary filmmaker had driven to Cassell and been politely turned away by Cole, who had appointed himself the operational firewall between Mara and the machinery of her own story without being asked. At school, which she returned to during the second week of Reconstruction, things were different in ways that were sometimes better and sometimes simply different. Some of her classmates treated her like a person they'd always known, which was the response she preferred. Others treated her like a text they'd been assigned to interpret. 3 people apologized for things they'd watched happen without intervening, and she accepted each apology as it came without ceremony. Because they were real, and she could tell they were real, and real things deserved acknowledgement. Harlan Briggs was gone. His family had left Cassell in the week following the arrests. Riker Sloan remained but moved through the school with the invisibility of someone who has recalculated his situation and found that being unremarkable is now the optimal strategy. Grady Finn had been formally charged with criminal surveillance and released on conditions that did not include attending school in Cassell. Preston came back to school in the 3rd week. He came in quietly on a Tuesday morning without announcement and found his way to a seat at the back of first period AP History where no one spoke to him and he spoke to no one. Mara watched him in her peripheral vision and registered what she saw: a person who had burned his entire prior social structure down, not under duress exactly, but under the specific pressure of a conscience that had apparently been present all along without having had anywhere to go. She walked over to him at the end of class. He looked up at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his default, now braced and underneath the brace genuinely uncertain whether she had anything for him other than the weight of what he'd done. "You should come by the diner when it opens," she said. He blinked. "If you're serious about making amends," she said, "show up regularly, because talk is the cheapest thing there is and showing up costs something." He nodded slowly. "Okay." "And Preston," she looked at him directly, "your father is going to spend a significant portion of the rest of his life in federal custody. That's a real thing you're going to carry. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter." She paused. "But what you did testifying all of it, that also matters. Both of those things are true." She left him sitting with that. The trial of Gerald Strom ran for 3 weeks in federal court in Helena. Mara testified twice. She sat in the witness box and said what had happened and what it had cost. And when Strom's attorney suggested she had benefited from her allegations, she looked at him steadily and said that she had lost a restaurant a year of sleep, and the last version of her father's death she'd been allowed to believe was an accident. The jury deliberated for 9 hours, guilty on all counts. She heard the verdict on her phone while she was restocking the pie display at the newly rebuilt diner, and she put the phone down and finished restocking. And when her mother came through the kitchen door and asked what had happened, Mara said it was over and meant it for the first time since any of this had started. Dale Voss died in the hospital on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after his arrest, before his own trial began. The official cause was cardiac arrest. The circumstances were examined carefully by the federal investigation and determined to be natural, no evidence of intervention, though the investigation remained open on that question. His attorney, acting on standing instructions that had been filed before any of them understood the full shape of what was coming, released a video recording 47 minutes long. In it, Voss named 31 individuals across 4 state agencies, 3 private companies including Harwell Energy, and 2 federal positions. He spoke with the methodical precision of a man who has decided that if he is going down, the falling will be useful. He described the scheme to acquire Valley land at distressed prices. He described Strom's role and Harwell's role and the coordination between them. He described a meeting at the Black Ridge Mine Administrative Office, 18 months before the explosion, at which Roy Sutton's name had been raised as a problem that needed to be managed. The DOJ began examining 2 federal positions within 48 hours of the video's release. 3 more arrests followed within the week. Mara learned about the video the same afternoon it was released from Morrow, who called her while she was painting the interior of the rebuilt diner. She stood in the new kitchen with a paint roller in her hand and listened and said thank you and ended the call. She painted for another hour before she stopped. She was not glad Voss was dead exactly. She was not sorry. What she felt was something more like the completion of a shape that had been forming since October. The last line drawn, the figure closed the thing that had been incomplete, becoming finally whole. The man who had made certain that Roy Sutton's death stayed buried had in his own dying made certain it couldn't stay buried anymore. There was something in that which Mara could not name cleanly. She was not going to try. The diner opened on a Saturday morning in November. Delia had hung the same sign hand-lettered in the same font by the same woman in town who had lettered the original 11 years ago and had replaced the photographs that had burned with new ones. The family pictures Roy in his hard hat at the mine entrance, Mara at various ages, but also new photographs taken over the preceding weeks of the reconstruction and the volunteers and Cole and his brothers drinking coffee on the half-built porch, and Delia laughing at something someone had said in the background of a construction photo. The line stretched past the parking lot and onto the highway shoulder by 8 in the morning. Mara worked the register. Delia worked the kitchen with two new staff members, young women from Cassell who had been hired the previous week. The morning moved at a pace that didn't allow for thinking about anything beyond the immediate orders and change and coffee and the specific energy of 300 people wanting to be in the same place because the place meant something they couldn't necessarily articulate but felt strongly enough to stand in line for 40 minutes in November, cold to access. People said things to her at the register, some brief, some longer. A man who had been a regular for years and had stopped coming. The week of Preston's original harassment told her he was sorry for that quietly, with his eyes on the counter, and she said she understood and gave him his change, and he took his coffee and went to a table and sat down and read the paper. And everything about that transaction felt to Mara exactly like what repair was supposed to look like. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just the resumption of ordinary things that had been interrupted. Several people she didn't recognize came through the line and said they'd driven from outside the county. One woman from Billings said she'd driven 3 hours because she wanted to be able to tell her granddaughter she'd been there. Mara thanked her and meant it. Mrs. Alderman, who had taught Mara sophomore English and had known about the harassment, and said nothing stood in line for 30 minutes, and when she reached the register, looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a thing and is finding the execution harder than the rehearsal. "I should have done something," she said. "When I saw what was happening, I had more authority than I used." "I know," Mara said. "I was afraid of my job, of the Voss family, of what it would cost me." A pause. "That's not an excuse." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." She looked at the woman. "But you're here." Mrs. Alderman nodded, took her coffee, and went to a table near the window and sat for a long time looking out at the highway. Preston came in at 9:30 alone and sat at the counter without being asked. Mara brought him coffee without being asked. They did not have a long conversation. He drank his coffee and left a 20 on a $7 tab and came back Thursday. Cole and 3 of his brothers occupied a corner table from opening to noon and drank more coffee than was probably medically advisable and argued about something mechanical with the dedication of people who argue about things they love. Mara brought them refills and listened to fragments of the argument and felt the normalcy of it move through her like something she had forgotten the taste of. At midday, she slipped out through the kitchen to the alley behind the diner and stood in the cold with her back against the new wall. New studs, new siding, new paint, but standing in exactly the same place the old wall had stood and breathed. She had been the person things happened to for so long that she wasn't certain yet how to be the person things happened because of. The adjustment was real and ongoing, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, not to herself, not here in the cold alley alone. But she was alive. The diner was alive. Her mother was inside making eggs for 300 people. And the men who had arranged her father's death and spent 3 years arranging their lives in Cassell, Montana, as though other people's lives were material to be shaped according to their convenience. Those men were facing federal indictments in 4 separate jurisdictions or were already gone. She thought about Roy Sutton at the kitchen table, about the quietness that had settled over him in those final weeks, about what it must have taken to decide that the right thing required risk, even when you had people who depended on you, even when the risk was real and the cost was real, and you couldn't guarantee that the doing right would actually produce the right outcome. He had tried. The people above him had made certain he paid for trying, And then they had buried what he knew and gone on running their scheme and collecting their money and drinking their coffee and looking at themselves in the mirror each morning without apparent difficulty. And then his daughter had gotten tired of being quiet on a Friday afternoon in October. And in the end, years after Roy, through a chain of events that neither of them could have anticipated, his daughter had completed what he'd started. Not in the way he would have done it. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without fire and fear, and miles of dark road and a borrowed phone, and a truck she didn't have a license to drive. But it was done. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the diner reopened, in an envelope with an Idaho return address, written in handwriting that managed to look both careful and urgent, the handwriting of someone who had drafted and redrafted before committing to the final version. The letter was from a girl named Wren Holloway, 15 years old, from a small town outside Boise. She wrote that she had been bullied for 2 years by the daughter of her town's mayor, who controlled enough of the town's administration to make the usual channels ineffective. She wrote that teachers had looked away and the principal had looked away, and she had begun to believe that the looking away was simply how the world was organized, and she would have to learn to live inside that organization. Then she had found Mara's story. She had watched every video, read every article, sat with the town hall gymnasium footage on her laptop at 2 in the morning, and watched a 17-year-old girl stand in the center of a room coming apart and refuse to move, and understood for the first time that the looking away was not a law of nature. It was a choice, and choices could be countered by other choices. Wren Holloway had documented everything, had gone to the school board rather than the principal, had contacted a journalist in Boise. The mayor's daughter had been suspended. The mayor had resigned 2 weeks later under investigation for misuse of municipal funds, a separate issue that the scrutiny had surfaced. "I don't know if I would have done any of it without your story," Wren wrote. "I don't know if I would have believed it was possible. Thank you for being the first person who showed me what fighting back looked like. Thank you for not stopping." Mara read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table in the trailer. They had moved back to the trailer the previous week, the familiar walls and the reinforced insulation and the narrow beds and the photograph of Roy on the small shelf above the television. The photograph was the same one from before. Delia had kept it in her jacket pocket the night the diner burned a reflex she hadn't been able to explain when Mara asked her about it later. She folded the letter and set it down. Outside, she could hear the wind working at the mountain ridges, the November cold pressing down from the north, the way it did every year in this valley, indifferent to everything that happened in it. She picked up a pen and found a sheet of paper. She wrote, "Dear Wren, my name is Mara Sutton. I'm 17 years old. I want to tell you something important, which is that I was scared the entire time." She paused, looked at that sentence, then kept writing. Because scared and done are not the same thing. They never were. And the space between them, that gap where you're terrified and you move anyway, that's not courage exactly. It's something more specific than courage. It's the moment you decide that what you're afraid of losing doesn't matter as much as what you're afraid of becoming if you stay quiet. I stayed quiet for 3 years. I watched things happen, and I made myself small, and I told myself it was survival. And it was. But there comes a point where survival and surrender start to look the same from the outside, and the only person who can tell the difference is you. You found that point. You found it earlier than I did, and with less help than I had, and that matters. That's not nothing. That's everything. I'm glad you wrote. Write again if you need to. She signed it, folded it, found an envelope. That evening in the rebuilt diner, after closing while her mother was doing the accounts at the corner table, and Cole was fixing something under one of the booths that had come slightly loose in the second week of operation, Mara sat at the counter with a letter in its envelope and a cup of coffee and looked at the new walls and the new photographs in the row of coffee cups hanging on their hooks above the machine. She looked at the photograph of Roy in his hard hat at the Black Ridge Mine entrance. He was squinting slightly into the camera the way he always squinted in photographs, and his expression was the one he'd worn when he was content. Not happy exactly, because Roy Sutton had been a man who found happiness in motion in the doing of things, and standing still for a camera was not motion. But content, present, looking at something he had built that he believed in. She had his jawline. People had always told her that. She had never known quite what to do with the observation until now, sitting in the rebuilt diner with the accounts being done and the coffee going cold and the envelope in her hands. She thought about what Roy had tried to do in those quiet weeks before the explosion. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about Delia keeping his photograph in her jacket pocket on the night everything burned a reflex too fast and too certain to have been conscious, the way the body makes the important decisions before the mind is caught up. Same people, same silence, except not anymore. The girl who had learned to walk invisible through the hallways of Cassell High School, who had memorized which bathrooms were safe and which lunch tables were protected, and how to make herself part of the furniture before anyone remembered she existed, that girl was still here. Changed, yes. Carrying things she would carry for a long time. The quarry, the brick, the photograph on the phone, that wasn't real but had felt real. The sound of a gunshot in a gymnasium, her father's name in a federal case file. She would carry all of it, but she would carry it standing up, in a rebuilt diner that smelled like coffee and new wood, beside a mother who was humming something under her breath while she added columns of numbers. Down the street from a man who had driven here for other reasons and stayed because the ground was about to shift, and who was currently arguing with a booth about the appropriate tightness of mounting hardware and losing. Mara Sutton was 17 years old, and she had brought down a sheriff and a deputy attorney general and a mining company and a decade-long criminal conspiracy because she had gotten tired of being quiet on a Friday afternoon in October. She had not done it cleanly. She had not done it without help. She had not done it without cost. But she had done it. And somewhere in Boise, Idaho, a 15-year-old girl named Wren Holloway had found what was possible by watching someone else find it first. And somewhere in a way that Mara could not articulate but understood completely, Roy Sutton had finally been heard. She picked up her coffee. She looked at his photograph one more time. Then she turned back to the counter, in the evening, in the work of being a person whose story was not over yet.